We're up to lecture 21 now, and we're up to the last section of chapter 22 in your textbook. So, 22.5, and as you can see then, we'll be talking about hormonal control of female reproductive functions. Let's begin by following along on the outline. And so, female sex hormones include a group of estrogens and also include progesterone. And you may remember these were first mentioned this semester back in chapter 13 on endocrine system. And now we're going to be coming back to these particular hormones. Back to your outline then, the primary source of estrogens in non-pregnant females is the ovaries. Although, again, as we know by now, as we've talked about before, some of these are produced by the adrenal androgens. So the androgens, the male sex hormones, recall, are converted into female sex hormones. And again, those androgens then that are converted, those androgens produced, remember, by the adrenal cortex, by the superficial layer of the adrenal gland. And then note the ovaries are also the primary source of progesterone in non-pregnant females. Talking about estrogens then, talking about what these hormones called estrogens do. And notice number one on your handout, they stimulate the enlargement of the female reproductive organs. And number two, they stimulate the development and the maintenance of female secondary sex characteristics. And these are listed for you then. And so these female secondary sex characteristics include development of mammary glands, increased deposition of adipose tissue in the breasts and the thighs and the buttocks. And then that number three, if you would go ahead and change that to a letter C. And so a third female secondary sex characteristic then will be increased vascularization, increased blood vessel development of the skin. And just as within males, we talked about the fact that these male secondary sex characteristics appear at puberty, and now realize, of course, that it's the same in females. And so in females at puberty, we have the development of these female secondary sex characteristics. So again, that's talking about estrogen. That's talking about what estrogen, or actually estrogens, do. And notice also then progesterone causes changes in the uterus during the menstrual cycle. And we will talk about that next lecture. So the last thing we want to do here with lecture 21 is to take a look now, and this is not referenced, this is not indicated on your lecture outline, but I'd like you to turn to page 850 and take a look at figure 2230 down at the bottom of the page. And notice then the title, Control of Female Secondary Sex Characteristics Development. And let's go ahead now and work our way through figure 2230. So up at the top of the figure, this should look very familiar by now. So we have the hypothalamus producing a releasing hormone that allows the pituitary gland to secrete FSH and LH follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And remember then, earlier, we talked about the effects of FSH and LH in males, and now notice these same hormones in females have different actions. So following the arrows down then from these two hormones, lower left-hand part of the figure, and we're talking then first of all about FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and notice here FSH stimulates maturation of primordial follicles. And I'll give you a minute to just jot that down in your notes. So one of the two things that FSH is doing in females stimulates the maturation of primordial follicles. And here, I'd suggest not going back at the moment, but just jotting down in your notes, talking about this process of primordial follicles maturating, becoming mature. Here, I'd refer you back to page 844 and figure 22.22. Secondly, notice that FSH is also stimulating meiosis and stimulating primary oocytes to form secondary oocytes. So again, a second action of FSH in females, stimulating meiosis, basically stimulating meiosis 1, going from primary oocytes to secondary oocytes. And here, I'll refer you back to page 843 and figure 2021. And so again, don't flip back at the moment, but basically 2021 is the process of oogenesis. So that's FSH, two things it's doing, two effects that it's having. Also, again, back to the figure, the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, remember, is also secreting LH, luteinizing hormone. And let's take a look at what's happening as a result. So the very lower left now portion of figure 2230, and luteinizing hormone then participates in the release of a secondary oocyte. It's part of the cause of ovulation. It contributes to ovulation, to the release of that egg cell, that secondary oocyte. And then also notice, just a reminder here, that after ovulation occurs, what's left of the follicle, what's not released during ovulation, becomes the corpus luteum. And here, for LH, I'll again refer you back to page 844 and again to figure 22.22. So not at the moment, but just as a reminder when you're reviewing. And so we have FSH, and we have LH then. And notice now down at the bottom of the figure, we have the ovaries secreting estrogens. And so we're concentrating now on estrogens, and again, we'll talk about progesterone later, but the ovaries then secreting estrogens. If you follow the arrow coming away from estrogens, notice a number of effects, a number of arrows kind of branching off. And so here, take just a minute and you might just want to check or somehow identify of these effects of estrogens which are production of female secondary sex characteristics. And again, then secondary sex characteristics, so development of the breasts. Down below, increased deposition of adipose tissue in the breasts and the thighs and the buttocks. And number 3, increased vascularization of the skin. So again, these 3 effects of estrogens make up the production of female secondary sex characteristics. And then notice also estrogens are causing thickening of the endometrium of the uterus, thickening of that inner lining of the uterus. And we'll see this in the next lecture, in the final lecture for this chapter, when we do menstrual cycle. And then notice also estrogens causing the enlargement of accessory reproductive organs. Again, organs other than the ovaries. And finally, just as we did with the similar figure looking at effects of FSH and LH in males, with this figure also, upper right-hand part of the figure, you can cross off, you can disregard the 2 arrows coming up with a negative sign. Again, these are things involved in negative feedback, in making sure that not too much of various hormones is produced and we don't get overstimulation and overdevelopment going on. But again, I don't want to take the time to go into specifically what's going on in terms of negative feedback. And with that, we're finished with lecture 21, and we'll be coming back to lecture 22 and looking at, on page 852, figure 2231, and at the same time we'll be bouncing back and forth between that figure and table 22.4 on the following page, on page 853. And we're done with lecture 21.